going on, guys? My name's Chris. You're watching Raising the Bar. Today, we're going to be talking about humble beginnings and setting realistic expectations for what it is you want to achieve. The reason that we're talking about this today is because it's so easy to get fixated on the end game goal of what it is you're looking to achieve. So let's say, for instance, you want to be rich. You initially gravitate towards the idea of having large sums of cash, but you don't necessarily fixate and gravitate towards the process it takes to get there. And it's very easy for us to cloud our judgment, cloud our sense of self-worth, because what we want seems so distant and so far out. What I like to do in these situations, and I recommend you do this as well, take somebody that you look up to, somebody that you admire, and try to look at the early content that they've produced or anything in the initial years of when they were getting started. A great way to do this is to read biographies. That's my favorite genre because it allows me to tangibly understand the path that it took for somebody that I deem successful to get to where they are. You can do this nowadays in a very simple way by looking at, let's say, YouTubers, for instance. You can go back and look at their early content and compare their camera presence, compare how they animate, compare how they engage with the audience, even compare the format that they use. Great example of this is Dave from How to Beast. If you go back and you look at Dave's early content, you'll see that it was relatively mundane, very basic, and there wasn't a lot of animation. But then fast forward to where he is now, there's drone footage, there's cinematics, there's engagement, and you can watch the progression as time's gone on to where he was able to get that level of professional development when it came to his content. This is a very small example, but it's very important to take a look at influential figures and how they got their start, so that way you can have your own set of realistic expectations and not get deterred when things don't happen right away or don't happen on the time frame that you wish. Overnight success is never overnight. It does not work that way. It's grind, 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 and then there's some luck involved, and then it snowballs. But in order to get that momentum, you need to get started. You need to engage and execute upon what it is that you want to establish. There's a great photo that I'm going to put on the screen right now. The photo that you're looking at is Jeff Bezos in his early office at Amazon. You can see the spray painted Amazon logo. You can see that it's very basic. But you're also looking at the richest guy in the world right now and how he got started. We could even take it a step back and talk about when he started the company in his parents' garage. You're looking at an actual office here. But I like to look at this image because it helps me understand that even the most successful people come from humble beginnings. You see this a lot with musicians. A lot of musicians out there go through a very, very difficult period to get to where they are. Same thing with actors. Same thing with pretty much any non-traditional based occupation where there isn't a clearly defined career path. It's up to you to carve that path out on your own. Almost every entrepreneur goes through this where it's a series of trial and error and trying this, trying that, figuring out what works, figuring out what doesn't. Another great example is Aaron Marino from Alpha M. Aaron is very unique because by the time that he's 30, and he talks about this on his channel, he was selling beer out of a beer cart and had just filed for bankruptcy because his gym didn't plan out and he was essentially lost, but he never gave up. He pivoted and realized, okay, that initial entrepreneurial venture was not for me. It didn't pan out, so what can I do differently in the future? And that's life. It's a series of trial and error, figuring out what works, what doesn't work. And yeah, you might have to pay a little cash along the way. You might lose money along the way. And that's all right, because you're paying a little bit of life tuition. Rather than paying some university or some educational institution money, you can actually expense money to try new things, be adventurous, figure out what works, and then pivot accordingly. But if you don't have that mentor, that person that's going to guide you down that path as to what you should do, what you shouldn't do, sometimes it's on you, right? You got to figure out what's going to work for what it is that you want in your life. This principle can be applied all over your life, from establishing relationships to building your body to establishing yourself financially. There's so many different avenues that you could take this, but understand that it's not going to be an overnight simple process. It's going to take time, dedication, and your own due diligence to ensure that you're going to get to where you want. And don't get discouraged along the way. when something doesn't work or something doesn't happen fast enough. We need to understand and we need to dial it back and realize that if we want something great, you need to be patient. That patience and that determination coupled together are going to ensure that you can accomplish what it is that you want to achieve. You got to sit down and think about this, because if you're taking the stance of why me, why is this not happening fast enough, or this isn't working, or anything along those lines, I want you to remember one thing. You cannot fail if you do not give up. I'm going to say that one more time. You cannot fail if you do not give up. This is where a lot of people go wrong, and why people get deterred is because you don't have the patience, you don't have the perseverance necessary to achieve what it is that you want. And the more elaborate and extravagant your goals happen to be, the longer that road typically happens to be, and you got to acknowledge that. You got to think about these things. Last night I was sitting there watching a movie, and I couldn't help but look at a lot of these actors that I didn't recognize that were on the older end of the spectrum. And I couldn't help but wonder to myself, have these people been acting, trying to get into the movies their entire lives, and now they're 50, 60 years old and they finally made it? Or did they start later? I like to think that they've been trying to get to that level of superstardom their entire lives, and it took them that long to achieve it. Now, is that a good way to go about doing things, thinking that, oh, this is going to take me 30 years to get to where I want to be? No, it's not, but it also helps you stay grounded when it comes to what it is you're trying to achieve. Some folks can do it in 2 years, some folks can do it in a year, some folks do it in 30 years. But it doesn't really matter how long it takes, because you're working towards something. You're establishing that sense of pride. And when you take a look at a project, I want you to have the patience, have the due diligence, because as human beings, we're very unique in the regard that we can learn anything, and we have the ability to think for ourselves and also be able to pivot accordingly. So when we recognize something's not working, we can make those changes. We can adjust and do what it is that we need to do to figure out what works. And sometimes that process takes a long time, and we have to be able to accept that. And this is something that's difficult for me to accept, but I always reinforce it. I always go back and look at the early YouTubers and where they got started. I go back, I look at Jeff Bezos, and I see that early office, and I think to myself, this guy had such extravagant goals, so much that he wanted to achieve, and despite having a rocky startup and not knowing everything, he was still able to do it. This is where being resourceful really comes back into play here, because there are going to be things that you want to accomplish, and there's going to be questions that you have along the way that you don't have the answers to. And that's okay. You're not supposed to know everything right away. Sadly, life doesn't work like that. So you need to establish that level of resourcefulness to get those answers for yourself, but also understand that anything great is going to take time. It is also worth mentioning here that if it does not take that long for you to achieve it, chances are you might not appreciate it as much, and it won't mean as much to you. But let me give you an example of what I'm talking about here. For instance, your first car. Your first car that I give you is a Ferrari. You get a Ferrari at 16 years old. You're jazzed up. You're at a 10. You're pumped. You're excited. You can't believe it. Now, a few years later, we fall on tough times. Now we got to get rid of that Ferrari, and I got to give you a 1999 Honda Civic. Well, guess what? You're going to hate it. You're not going to be excited at all, because you just came from that Ferrari that you were given right out of the gate. In order to establish that level of 10 on the excitement scale, I think it should be something that's earned and that you gradually work up to, because otherwise you won't be able to appreciate things along the way. Now, when I say that, what I'm talking about is if you receive that instant gratification and you receive that dopamine hit, that sensation of accomplishment immediately, well, as you get all of those rewards, what's next? How do you perpetuate that? A good example of where this goes wrong is you typically see this with childhood actors and those that are young that strike it big. How many times do you see a childhood actor that falls into drug addiction, that is, not doing very well in their life later on? Because they had this instant success, everybody was a yes man to them, thought that they were amazing, and then the reality of the world hits them when their fame and their time in the spotlight fades away, what's left? If it's a more gradual approach, I think you'll have a greater sense of appreciation for what you'll accomplish. So don't try to make this an overnight thing. Understand it's going to take time, and that is okay. Because then when you finally get there, when you finally achieve what it is that you want, think about how gratifying that would be. You've spent 10 years working on something, and you finally see it come to fruition. Imagine that level of gratification. Far greater than if it happened in 6 months or a year, or even overnight, hypothetically. Hopefully you guys like this video. Please comment, like, and subscribe down below if you know what I'm talking about. Hopefully this helps you guys out on your journey to not get discouraged, to stay with that perseverance mindset and accomplish what it is that you want to get out of life. Thank you so much for listening, guys. Feel free to visit my website, RTBTransformations.com. And with that, I'm out of here.